Deep in Midwest Americana, just outside the city of St. Louis, lies the buried corpse of a town. Once a place where children laughed and played along pastoral waterways amidst a community that genuinely cared for one another, it now stands devoid of humanity, slowly rotting beneath the surface. But this was no ordinary town. This was Times Beach, Missouri. This was a town that truly looked out for its residents. This was a town that had survived the Great Depression through hard work and community spirit. This was a town that rebuilt itself time and time again. So what catastrophic event could have occurred here that compelled everyone to leave everything behind? Now, this is a story that forces you to ask yourself, what is home? It's a story about struggle and resilience. It's a story about community, and it's a story about humanity. Welcome to Times Beach. Population? 0. To understand why this small town went from paradise to poisonous, we need to examine its founding. The history not only reveals the human story behind its transformation, but also connects us to the people who were there when everything went so wrong. Times Beach was established in a way that you might not expect. It was a newspaper promotion. Back in 1925, when it seemed like American land was almost boundless, the old St. Louis Times, a regional newspaper, launched an advertisement that you wouldn't believe could happen today. By purchasing a 6-month newspaper subscription for $67.50, a person could claim a tract of land in Times Beach. It was touted as an idyllic little hamlet nestled in the woods just 27 kilometers, or about 17 miles for those who use that measure, from the heart of St. Louis. Now, don't get me wrong, this land was insanely cheap. It comes out to about $1,237 in 2025 money. Sure, that's expensive for a 6-month newspaper subscription, but for land, it was a pretty good deal. Realistically, however, you needed 2 parcels to have enough space to build a small house or a cabin. And look, in 1925, $2,500 wasn't exactly easy money for most people, but for some, it was manageable with a bit of saving. Alternatively, you could make a $10 down payment on the land and pay the rest in installments of $2.50 per month. A pretty sweet deal that attracted many buyers. Now, the newspaper had actually purchased the land from a farmer and rebranded it as a paradise resort, a haven for doctors, managers, and high society individuals from St. Louis to unwind during the summer. They could enjoy fishing in the mighty Merrimack River and forget about the troubles of the interwar years. Times Beach wasn't designed for permanent habitation, at least not yet. It functioned more as a holiday park than as a true settlement. A full-page advertisement once proudly declared, "The sweltering heat and discomfort of the city are unknown at Times Beach." However, this idyllic slice of rural Americana wouldn't remain unchanged for long. Have you ever searched for something on the internet, and then for the next week, all you're seeing is it advertised to you? Like, oh, for God's sake, I don't want it. I don't even know why I looked at this. It's "Stop following me around" advert. It's creepy. Well, look, that ain't a coincidence. That's called tracking, and that's where today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN, comes in. They stop all of that shit. It keeps your online activity private, even on sketchy public Wi-Fi. You know, you go into that coffee shop and it's like free Wi-Fi. You're like, no password, no security, no nothing. Well, you've got security if you're using Surfshark. And if you don't, well, I mean, that's on you. You're going to get into trouble. I mean, not guaranteed, but with Surfshark, you're guaranteed not to get into trouble. It encrypts your data so hard that it just can't be unencrypted. It works on unlimited devices, and you don't have to pick between your phone, your laptop, your smart TV, whatever. Plus, there's Surfshark's Clean Web, which blocks ads, malware, and trackers before they load. So you're safe, you're not annoyed, you're having a great time online. Go to surfshark.deals/places and use the promo code PLACES to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. And now back to today's episode. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Missouri, largely composed of farmland, was devastated by the economic collapse. Suddenly, many doctors, managers, and others who had saved up for a modest timeshare close to home found themselves struggling to survive. While food was scarce and families across the entire US suffered, those on the outskirts of Missouri decided to take a chance. Marilyn Leisner, the last mayor of Times Beach, was interviewed by the St. Louis Magazine in 2017. Although she had not lived through the Great Depression, she was well acquainted with the settlement's history. She recalled, quote, "During the Depression, a lot of people in the city moved into their homes in Times Beach to ride out the hard times," end quote. The prices in the city were simply too high, making it tempting to downsize to a smaller rural community where the competition for money and bread was less fierce. This strategy worked for those who relocated, although surviving the Depression was never easy for anyone. Worse yet, in the 1930s, the states were ravaged by the Dust Bowl, as soil erosion and high winds transformed Middle America into a scene reminiscent of Mad Max, just with less mutants and cars. The people of Times Square could never have known it, but the dust that eventually blew in from afar would trigger a chain reaction, ultimately leading to the town's evacuation in the early 80s. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Despite the hardship, Times Beach slowly began to grow, not only in population, but also in one of the most important elements of a functioning settlement: community spirit. Cottages on stilts, once built to avoid flooding, gave way to modular homes and even a few brick houses. There were 4 churches and 4 taverns, offering residents a way to balance their sins with their faith, true to the Midwest spirit. The liquor store doubled as a tackle shop, and the town even boasted a town hall. To the dismay of longtime residents, a trailer park opened in the settlement, soon followed by another, and the town even earned itself a 7-Eleven. How fancy. Of course, it wasn't perfect, nor was it affluent. Missouri, and Times Beach in particular, clawed its way out of the Great Depression, a struggle that persisted for decades. Yet that shared experience, that sense of belonging forged in hardship, ensured that the people were happy. Between picnics in nature with your neighbors, river recreation, town dances, and that old community spirit America once embraced before the suburbs took over, life was pastoral and nurturing. It was a simple life, but it was a good life. A tiny slice of paradise where the value you placed on the company around you far outweighed the company at work. Former Mayor Leistner once said, "It was like everybody was related to everybody." Residents described stories of leaving their houses unlocked and watching over each other's children. It was a growing, yet close-knit community, one that was welcoming and homely, sort of like a family. By 1982, the small town had blossomed to a population of around 2,500, and pretty much nobody in the United States would have heard of it if it hadn't been for a looming disaster that would cost some residents everything. Now, so far, we have an idyllic little town experiencing some economic hardship and a bit of dust. But how did these factors lead to a disaster in this seemingly perfect community? Well, the answer lies in a few unusual circumstances occurring well outside the St. Louis bubble. To the southwest, on Highway 44, just past the city of Springfield, lies a small city called Verona. Now, during the 1970s, Verona was home to a pharmaceutical facility that was part leased by the private Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company, or NEPACO. This lease was from the building's original owner, Hoffman Taff. Eventually, NEPACO went under in 1976, and prior to that, in 1969, both the facility and Hoffman Taff were acquired by Syntex Agribusiness. So, what exactly was NEPACO producing there? Well, they were manufacturing a chemical known as hexachlorophene. This chemical was their primary product, and it was later banned in 1972 after 36 young children in France died due to its use in talcum powder. At the time, hexachlorophene was primarily used in cosmetics as well as in soaps and creams. Its eventual ban contributed significantly to NEPACO's downfall. Moreover, the chemical possessed serious environmental hazards, being acutely toxic in even small amounts. However, that product pales in comparison to what Hoffman Taff and later Syntex were producing. And you've probably heard of this one. They were making Agent Orange, which contains very high concentrations of a chemical called dioxin. So yeah, the chemicals dropped on Vietnam for a decade under Operation Ranch Hand were produced right here. As you can probably tell by what happened to the Vietnamese, dioxins are not very good for you. Short-term exposure to high levels of dioxins causes skin lesions and altered liver function, while long-term exposure is linked to impairments in the immune system, the developing nervous system, the endocrine system, and reproductive functions. Chronic exposure is additionally associated with various cancers. So, not really ideal, but how does a chemical plant located hundreds of kilometers from Times Beach lead to Times Beach's ultimate destruction? And well, the answer lies in logistics. Like all chemical plants, these facilities generate waste, and most of them adhere to meticulous procedures and strict regulations for its disposal. However, it appears that the facility in question and those involved in its operations fell remarkably short of these standards. And it's here that we introduce the next character in our story, and that's a businessman named Russell Bliss. At that time, Bliss worked as a waste hauler and had been contracted to dispose of unusable chemical sludge byproducts. However, he wasn't completely honest about his methods for handling the waste. While some of it was either stored or dumped, another option he considered would have led to an ecological disaster for Times Beach. Part of Bliss's services as a waste hauler was the ability to upcycle unwanted materials into something useful. A businessman at heart, Bliss knew that he could make extra money by getting double duty out of what he hauled. He was often tasked with hauling away used motor oil, which he repurposed as a dust suppressant to spray on roads. Remember the dust? That's exactly why it's important. Bliss mixed some of the chemical waste with the used motor oil to create a dust suppressant formulation, which he would then spray on anything that needed it for a fee. Roads, buildings, houses, churches, farmland, you name it. The oil, however, was contaminated with some of the worst pollutants imaginable, and he did a whole lot of spraying in the Times Beach area. Within a few days, cats, dogs, and birds in the vicinity began dropping dead. Horses fell ill, and eventually Part had to bury more than 50 of them. Worst of all, her 2 young daughters who played in the area later became sick. But hell hath no wrath, like a mother scorned, and as far back as 1971, Part suspected that the oil sprayed by Bliss was the culprit. Determined, she donned her amateur detective's cap and began tailing Bliss and the other drivers who worked for him. In doing so, she uncovered a connection between Bliss and the chemical plant in Verona. Ultimately, she won a lawsuit against both Bliss and the chemical companies. Had people heeded her warning sooner, the abandonment of Times Beach might have been avoided. Then, in November 1982, a local reporter called the city to ask if Times Beach residents were aware that their town was highly contaminated with dioxins. They had not been. They weren't aware. Despite Part's suspicions from over a decade earlier, no one stopped Bliss from dispersing that toxic waste throughout the environment. Under a month later, disaster would strike Times Beach once again. The residents of Times Beach didn't take the news lying down. If their town was contaminated, they wanted to know with what and why. And it's here we introduce our final character today, and one of the many villains of today's story, the federal government, specifically the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. When the EPA learned of Times Beach's contamination, it informed the town that it would take a year before starting soil tests. Understandably, the residents weren't very happy with the idea of knowingly living on top of poisonous ground for an entire year. With their appeals falling on deaf ears, the town's inhabitants pooled their money to have Times Beach tested themselves. In a seemingly magical turn of events, the EPA managed to test the area almost immediately after learning of the private effort. Funny, isn't it? But something ominous was looming on the horizon for Times Beach, something far more threatening than government red tape and delays. The US Army Corps of Engineers had begun warning residents in the nearby low-lying areas that severe flooding was imminent. Weather forecasts predicted a massive storm capable of unleashing floods on any area situated on floodplains. Times Beach, nestled right along the Merrimack River, was in the direct path of this. Some residents evacuated, while many stubbornly chose to stay. They were accustomed to mild flooding. After all, the homes were built on stilts. Whenever a bit of damage occurred, the community would rally together, repair what was broken, and move on with their lives. They assumed this time it would just be the same pattern. With a steep, tall bank between the town and the river, they believed significant flooding was simply impossible. Unfortunately, they were wrong. On December the 5th, Missouri experienced some of the worst flooding in its history. Torrential rains caused the Mississippi River to rise by 3 meters. Water poured over the St. Louis Dam, and the Merrimack River, a tributary of the Mississippi, couldn't handle the surge, bursting its banks and rushing into Times Beach. Before long, the entire settlement was submerged underwater that reached nearly the second floors of buildings. Described as a once-in-500 years flood, houses were torn from their foundations, vehicles and trailers were swept away by the surge, and many residents found themselves trapped in their homes. It took an entire week for the waters to finally recede, allowing people to return to the devastation and begin the arduous process of rebuilding. Remarkably, and fortunately, no lives were lost. Shortly after, the town suffered a brutal 1-2 punch. The tests had come back, revealing the dioxin levels were alarmingly high. The EPA considered any concentration above 1 part per billion to be potentially hazardous, yet in Times Beach, the levels exceeded 100 parts per billion. To make matters worse, the contaminated water had washed dioxin around the ruins of people's homes, further poisoning the soil. When this news emerged, the town's penultimate mayor resigned, leaving Marilyn Leisner in charge. Ultimately, she would be the one forced to make the difficult decisions. Those who had returned after the EPA's tests were ordered to leave immediately, while anyone who had not yet come back was warned to stay away due to the potentially devastating effects of the flood and the toxic landscape. A guard was stationed at the entrance to the settlement, along with a caution sign posted on a bridge coming from the high side of the river, in order to keep people out. But the residents were conflicted and divided. Many didn't know whether to try and rebuild or to ask for a property buyout through the EPA's Superfund for Disaster Relief. Most of them eventually reached the grim conclusion that there was no quick fix for cleaning up the dioxins, and God knows what other chemicals were involved. After all, what was the point of rebuilding homes that had already been destroyed by the flood? A few years earlier, the town had voted itself out of the National Flood Insurance Program, a move that, though hindsight is 2020, had proven disastrously unwise. A number of people clung on, whether out of desperation, confusion, or outright denial of reality. They insisted that the dioxins were not dangerous. After all, they'd been present for decades without them causing them any harm. They'd rebuilt before, they would rebuild again. This was their home, and they weren't about to give it up without a fight. The divide became the canary in the coal mine for Times Beach. The debate raged, and although only a small minority wished to stay, it split farmers and friends apart. The literal foundations of the town had been eroded by the flooding, but Times Beach's true foundation, its community spirit, was irreparably damaged, poisoned, just like the ground beneath their feet. And as we all know, a house divided cannot stand. Mayor Leisner ultimately sided with the majority. She sent a petition, backed by hundreds of signatures, to President Ronald Reagan, requesting that the federal government purchase the homes in Times Beach at fair market value. The idea was to provide residents with enough money so that they could begin a new life somewhere else. In February 1983, the plan was approved, to the relief of many townsfolk. Still, those who refused to leave felt as though everything they had ever known was being betrayed. In May 1983, a second flood struck the community, deepening the despair for those clinging to the possibility of staying. Soon after, the first offers arrived. The federal government lowballed the residents. As Mayor Leisner recalled, the offers were very low, so we got organised. We would invite the press out, and we would spray paint the prices on the homes. Offers were based solely on square footage, which felt unfair to those who owned newer, better quality homes that would typically command higher prices in a regular market. Although an appeals process existed, one that might secure a few extra dollars for the dissatisfied homeowners, it offered only minimal relief, even with the additional relocation assistance provided by the Superfund. In cases where a new house outside of Times Beach cost more than the previous one, the Superfund program would cover part of the difference. It was a kind sentiment, but ultimately market forces prevailed, making the situation even more challenging for local residents. Sellers in the local area knew that many people would be buying houses. It wasn't hard to figure out that. Across the wider region, 80,000 people were eventually evacuated and made homeless by the flooding. Many of those displaced could choose to rebuild if they wished, while many opted to move instead. However, the residents of Times Beach had no choice. Consequently, house prices in the area spiked. People were forced to buy homes that were far from ideal or move further away from the only place they'd ever called home. What were they supposed to do? What options did they have? They took the money that they could and made do with what was available. There was no happy ending in sight. By 1985, only one elderly couple remained in the toxic town, a George and Lorene Klein, the final holdouts at Times Beach. In the end, those who chose to stay ended up with the worst deal of all. Properties that refused the EPA's buyout offers were condemned, meaning their houses were forcibly valued and sold by the courts. In fact, the judiciary's own appraisals came back even lower than the EPA offers, and they lacked the benefits such as relocation assistance. In time, everyone left, and by 1986, the town was officially disbanded. Times Beach was no more. Yet the story did not end with the town's abandonment. It was not until the 1990s that the state of Missouri finally managed to acquire all the property in Times Beach, enabling them to begin cleaning up a mess that they did not create. The EPA determined that incineration was the best method to decontaminate the site as thoroughly as possible. The incinerator would not only process contaminated soil from Times Beach, but also from dioxin sites throughout the state. In all, 265,000 tons of dirt from 27 different locations would be burned. Many people opposed the plan, suspecting that it would create an even greater environmental problem by releasing harmful toxic fumes across Missouri. Despite these concerns, the EPA stood firm and refused to answer questions about their strategy. They maintained that the incinerator would work. It would burn away and completely destroy the dioxins, leaving no worry about dioxin fumes. The critics argued that the focus was too narrow. What about the other pollutants in the soil, such as hexachlorophene? In some areas, harmful chemicals not even associated with the Verona plant could be released into the air across Missouri. It appeared that the EPA either didn't know about these additional risks or simply didn't want to know. Ultimately, they seemed more interested in finding someone to blame for this entire debacle. The buck stopped with Syntex, which was made legally responsible for both the cleanup and for exploring the full scope of the contamination. Syntex not only covered the cost of the cleanup, but also paid an additional $10 million on top. The EPA wasn't going to let a few people prevent them from closing this loop in their records. Eventually, though, after an outcry from a few dedicated individuals, the incinerator was shut down. Still, the EPA's Ombudsman, an internal organization in charge of handling individual complaints, recommended that the incinerator be retested for safety. However, the retest used the same flawed parameters as the first, and eventually, the rest of the soil was burned. In 2001, the former town was removed from the national priority list for federal cleanup. That was it. It was over. Or was it? Even all these years later, the legacy of the disaster that plagued Times Beach remains significant and for good reason. This environmental catastrophe didn't just mark the map with a ghost town, it ushered in a new era of environmental protection standards in the US, and that really was quite something. Moreover, the legacy of the town itself continues to resonate, living on through the people who experienced that ordeal firsthand. Animosity still lingers among the former residents. Some harbor resentment toward the federal government for its poor management of the situation, while others point the finger at the chemical companies responsible for the entire ordeal, and at Russell Bliss, who's equally culpable. Some are angry with God himself for unleashing a flood that destroyed their homes, and others direct their ire at former Mayor Leisner, who, many feel, forced them to leave everything behind for pocket change. Yet she wasn't solely to blame. She did everything she could to urge the EPA to revise its offers and secure adequate compensation. But she was just placed in an impossible situation. What bargaining power did a tiny town's mayor have against an entire governmental organization, especially when homes were destroyed and people were rendered homeless? In the end, those who refused the deal she helped broker ended up even worse off. What more could she have done? Leisner said in 2017 that she had no way of controlling what the EPA offered, quoting her here, "I didn't have anything to do with their money." People still have every right, though, to be bitter. Their homes were washed away or rendered uninhabitable, and the close-knit community, one forged in the fires of the Great Depression, and for many, the only place they'd ever known, was stripped from them. And it wasn't their fault. What about Bliss, though? What became of him once the disaster reached its climax? Well, he ended up getting sued out of the wazoo. For years, he and the chemical companies have been locked in a blame game. Bliss consistently denies even knowing that the materials were toxic, while the chemical companies maintain that they did, in fact, disclose the danger of the chemical waste. After all, it's a chemical plant. What did Bliss expect that he was hauling away? Fruit? Nonetheless, Bliss does have some evidence to back up his claim. He even sprayed the oil on his own property where he and his family lived. When asked about the situation, he said, quote, "If I thought it was something bad, would I spray it on my own farm where my family is? Would any human being do that?" Now, viewed favorably, Bliss might be seen as a naive man who believed he could make some easy money but ended up creating more problems for himself. However, many people doubt his account. Following the lawsuit that Part filed based on her amateur detective work in 1971, Bliss was forced to admit his waste-hauling activities and to identify the dozens of sites across the state where he had dumped it. That admission doesn't necessarily mean that he knew the waste was toxic. But if he didn't know it was toxic, why bury it? Why not take it to a dump or burn it like you would regular garbage? I guess ignorance really is bliss. Russell sees himself as a victim in all of this. Although he was sued repeatedly for his actions, and what he did wasn't technically illegal at the time, he eventually found himself in jail on tax evasion charges for failing to report his waste disposal income to the IRS. Speaking to CNN about those who blame him, he said, "I think it's unfair, unjust. All my friends say that I was a scapegoat." Maybe he's right. Who knows? There are still scientific disagreements surrounding dioxins today that stem directly from this disaster. Scientists generally disagree on how much exposure is needed to put a person at risk, a determination that likely depends on a whole host of factors. People who claim dioxins aren't dangerous often cite Dr. Vernon Hoke of the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. Yes, that's the third alphabet agency mentioned in today's video. Hoke was recorded as saying that the evacuation of Times Beach was an overreaction. However, those advocating this narrative tend to overlook the fact that Hoke was the one who ordered the evacuation in the first place. Some believe the US government had an ulterior motive in its handling of the Times Beach situation. For example, Steve Taylor, co-founder of the Times Beach Action Group, asserts that because the toxins at Times Beach were closely related to those found in Agent Orange, the government might have been motivated to downplay the investigation. By doing so, it could limit its own responsibility for what was happening with Agent Orange in Vietnam. This theory is supported by what many see as the EPA's lowball offer and delaying tactics in testing. After all, one might expect the Environmental Protection Agency to be primarily concerned with, protecting the environment. On the matter, Steve Taylor states, "The Vietnam veterans, referring to those who suffered from health complications due to Agent Orange, got a huge settlement. There are a lot of people I know who were exposed to the same stuff and more and didn't." And what of Times Beach today? The land, once known as Times Beach, has been transformed into Route 66 State Park. The only remaining structure is a former roadhouse, the old Bridgehead Inn, which now serves as a museum and gift shop offering various Route 66 knickknacks. The area is lush and inviting, with ample parking, a playground, and benches scattered throughout. Any lingering harmful chemicals appear to have minimal impact on the wildlife. Deer are frequently seen, and healthy, new growth trees are abundant. Nearby, a giant ash pit marks the site of the former incinerator, and a large mound stands where contaminated houses were buried. Only the soil was burned. Overall, the landscape is steadily healing. Each year, on the final Saturday in September, the former residents of Times Beach return to the site. They gather to reconnect with old friends, share stories, and shed tears for their lost home. Many say they would gladly move back in a heartbeat if given the chance today. The only real references to the town's existence are an ash pit and a single display tucked away in the corner of a museum. This scarcity of evidence is even more suspicious. It feels as though the US government was determined to hide the whole story. It comes off as an utter disservice to the memory of the town and those who lived and grew up there, an entire portion of one's life reduced to a small, overlooked exhibit in a museum somewhere. There's still a lingering generational trauma felt by those who once lived there. Back then, teachers made Times Beach children sit at the front of the class, away from their peers, fearing they might somehow be contagious with the toxins. People still recall the flood, the devastation, and the birds dying because of the chemicals. What resonates most about the Times Beach disaster is that there's no happy ending here. At least, not really. Former residents gather whenever they can, even as each passing year sees their old home slowly fade away to the inevitable march of time. That community spirit, however, can never return to what it once was. The buildings can't be rebuilt, and the memories can't be revisited. The story of Times Beach is a profoundly human one. It speaks of desperation, grief, and the search for purpose and belonging, while also reflecting corruption, greed, conspiracy, and the strength of banding together as a people. It's a tale about making hard decisions when there can be no winners, and ultimately, it's about moving on. Perhaps one day in the far future, people will again splash, swim, and fish in the Merrimack River at Times Beach. Thank you for watching.